Hi, and welcome to Putting the Recommended Practices to Work in Parent Centers. This webinar is part one of a two-part webinar series, and I'm Allison Jones. I am a technical assistance specialist with the Early Childhood Technical Assistance Center. We refer to it as ECTA, and I'm joined by my colleague, Stephanie Moss.
Hi, thanks, Allison. I'm Stephanie Moss. I am co-director at the Region B PTAC at Parent to Parent of Georgia, and I also work as the technical assistance specialist for ECTA. So as Allison mentioned, this is part one of a two-part series, and in today's part one session, we want to help participants become familiar with the Division for Early Childhood. We refer to that as DEC. We're also going to help you become familiar with the DEC Recommended Practices, or RPs. And then we're going to introduce you to a suite of resources that the Early Childhood TA Center has developed that really support family and professional use of the recommended practices. And this is a teaser, so we hope you'll come back for part two. In part two, we will have some other individuals presenting, our family ambassadors, who will help you understand how you can use the resources in your daily work in parent centers supporting families. One thing we do want to mention before we move into an explanation of DEC is that we want to be sure to let you know that we have included a slide at the back at the end of this presentation that will have a list of links to all of the resources that we're going to share with you today, as well as ECTA's website and DEC's website. And in addition to that, we've also created a handout that has that same list of links. So you can rest assured that you will have all of the content available to you by the end of this session. So what is DEC? DEC is the Division for Exceptional Children of the Council for Exceptional Children. This is an international membership organization for those who work with and on behalf of young children from birth to 8 with disabilities and other special needs in their families. Membership includes practitioners, parents and family members, program administrators, higher ed faculty, researchers, policymakers, professional development providers, and TA specialists, as well as students. DEC was actually started in 1973 and is one of 17 divisions of the Council for Exceptional Children. And it really is the voice for early intervention and early childhood special education. So when we think about it, DEC being that voice for young children, let's take a look at what DEC actually does for families. DEC promotes policies and practices that support families and enhances the optimal development of young children birth through 8 who have or are at risk for developmental delays and disabilities. And DEC provides guidance on early intervention and early childhood special ed practices that really promote better outcomes for young children with disabilities or delays and their families and the professionals that serve them. So what are the recommended practices? The recommended practices are a DEC initiative that really helps to bridge the gap between research and practice. It offers guidance and tips and recommendations and suggestions to parents and professionals who work with young children who have or are at risk for delays and disabilities. The primary goal of the recommended practices is to improve the quality of services for young children. And they really present the biggest bang or the highest leverage impact when we talk about working with young children. The recommended practices support, but I think it's also important to point out the recommended practices support development and learning for all children. And they can be delivered in all settings, including natural environments, inclusive settings. And they're really designed to build on standards for typical early childhood settings. So they're not duplicative. They're not another thing you have to do. They really support what's already in place and build on what exists. And it's, like I said, it is very important to note that they're not just disability specific, but they really support all children. So the recommended practices were first produced in 1991, and they've been updated a couple of times since then. In 2000, they were updated, and then again in 2014. And that's what I wanted to mention about that is that the 2014 revision was really when ECTA became involved in this work. They had some grant funding from the U.S. Department of Education, OSAP, and we're able to work to support the revision of the practices and the updates. And what you can see here is what is reflected in that most recent update. The recommended practices include 66 practices across 8 topic areas. You can see the topic areas on your screen and the number of practices that are associated with each of those areas. So now that you have kind of an idea of all of the areas that are covered by the recommended practices, hopefully you can start to understand why there's a need to spread the word about the practices. And so that's where the RP ambassadors come in. So we want to introduce you to our RP ambassadors and what their role is in this work. The RP ambassadors are charged with raising awareness, bringing awareness to the existence of the recommended practices, sharing information about the materials and products that support use of and implementation of the practices. We also, our ambassadors also collaborate with local, regional, and state entities to promote awareness of and use of the practices. And it's really all about improving systems and services and outcomes for young children, again, with or at risk for disabilities and their families. So one of the initiatives that started about a year ago in 2020 was the addition of family ambassadors to the ambassador program. What you see here is a way to find an ambassador. So there are ambassadors, 37 ambassadors across the country, not in every state, but hopefully we're getting there. We're moving towards that. And there are the family ambassadors are associated with parent training and information centers across the US. There are also professional ambassadors who are involved with Part C systems and preschool 619 programs, higher education faculty, technical assistance providers, and other professional capacities. But all of the ambassadors are working towards the same goal, promoting that awareness of the practices, promoting use of the recommended practices for better outcomes for kids and families. If you were to go, and this link, again, this link will be on the link resource at the end, but if you were to follow the link to find an ambassador, you would be able to see the full list of the 37 ambassadors, their affiliations, and learn a little bit more about them and how to get in touch with them.
Thank you, Stephanie. So, as Stephanie mentioned, back in 2014, the ECTA Center was brought in to support the work of the revisions to the DEC recommended practices, as well as the charge of really helping to operationalize those practices for practitioners and for families that would be using these practices to support children with disabilities or at risk for developmental delays. And so, as you can imagine, with 66 practices covering 8 topic areas, there was a need to really create some resources that would be used by practitioners in classrooms, during home visits, as well as by families. And so, based on that, there was a lot of work that was done to develop some ECTA practice improvement tools, and they're all based on the DEC recommended practices. And on each tool, you can see on the bottom of the tool that we're going to talk about in just a minute, it will refer back to the specific DEC recommended practices that it's associated with. So the key products that the ECTA Center developed to support the use of the recommended practices are the performance checklist for practitioners. And these are really checklists that provide you the key characteristics of performing that practice. And then there are practice guides for practitioners that really help unpack those key characteristics in a little bit more detail. The other thing that they created are the practice guides for families. And what's really cool about these practice guides is that the practice guides for practitioners are really in companionship with the practice guide for families. So they both take those key characteristics of a practice or those key ingredients of using a practice to support a child or a family, and they unpack them a little bit in more detail. So you can find a list of all of the resources again on the ECTA Center website. We have again provided a list at the end of this presentation. There's also a handout that will be available to you that accompanies this recording, and it'll also feature all of the links to the resources we refer to today. And so this is just a screenshot of what you will see when you go to the link for the practice improvement tools. And you'll see there's performance checklists. We also have them in Spanish. There's practice guides for practitioners, practice guides for families, and practice guides for families in Spanish. And then there's, again, a connection to the RP ambassadors. So if you're curious to know if there's an ambassador in your state or a neighboring state, you can take a look here and reach out to start making some connections in your area. And so these arrows just kind of highlight this again. And so what we want to do is show you what one of the practice guides look like. They've all been created using the same format. So the practice guides for families and practitioners both use adult learning strategies in their formatting. So the first thing is you'll see a description of the practice, which really defines what it is that you're talking about or that you're working on using with a child or with a family. Next, you'll see a video example that's embedded within the electronic or mobile version of the practice guide. This is a short video example that really illustrates the practice being used in a real life context of the classroom or home or community. And then you'll see a section that really gives you more description of those key characteristics that we mentioned, and they're bulleted, and kind of give you a little bit more examples as well, or strategies of how to use it. And then you'll see a quick vignette that will illustrate a real to life example of the practices being used. And then lastly, you'll see a section called "You'll Know the Practice is Working." This is a key piece of this practice guide that is often overlooked. And it's often overlooked in our work with adult learners as well. And that's really circling back once an adult has used the practice. This is a way to help them evaluate whether it's worked successfully, it's worked the way they intended, if they might want to try it again using another strategy that maybe they missed. So this is a really important piece of these practice guides. And they're very simple questions and prompts that you'll notice. These are also available in a mobile format. So if you are a practitioner providing home visits, or you're in a classroom setting, you can easily pull this up on your phone and share it with a family. You can also put the link to these materials in newsletters, in emails, and so forth. So families that maybe use mobile phones or devices to access information can easily pull this up and read it and use it. So we hope we have piqued your interest at this point about the recommended practices and about the resources that have been developed to support the use of these practices. And so if you're thinking of some challenges and dilemmas that you face in a day-to-day work, in your day-to-day role in the Parent Center, we hope that you will check out part 2 of this webinar series. Part 1, as you can see, was really kind of an introduction and foundational understanding of the practices, DEC. And in webinar 2, you will meet some family ambassadors who do work in parent centers that want to share with you real life scenarios or real to life scenarios that they have experienced or that they're aware of, in ways that the recommended practices support and address those challenges and dilemmas. And again, here's the resource list. You'll also have this available as a handout. And we encourage you to check out these links. There's a lot of great information here. And these, as Stephanie said, these materials support a variety of audiences. Thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you in part 2.